you. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. So, it's a great honor to be the first Stone lecturer at UCL. And so thanks so much for inviting me to present this lecture. It's always very humbling. So I don't know. I took this tentative title for today. Here is a picture of young Schumpeter. Schumpeter is known particularly for having introduced the term and the notion, the concept of creative destruction, by which he meant the process whereby new innovations displace old technologies. New innovations make old technologies obsolete. And for example, if you read Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy or other writings of Schumpeter, he tried to articulate a bit this notion. But when I studied economics, the standard growth model, the must, was Solow. It was a very elegant model of growth with essentially two equations. One equation would tell you how you produce output with capital and labor, and the second equation would tell you how you accumulate capital. Savings, you accumulate capital, and of course depreciation decumulates capital. And under reasonable assumptions of decreasing returns to capital accumulation, you would get no long-run growth of per capita GDP, because at some moment you would run out of steam. Going from 0 machine to 1 machine, you increase a lot production, but from going from 9 machines to 10 machines, you increase production by just a little bit, and at some moment, depreciation catches up with the accumulation that comes from savings. And at that point, you can't grow just from capital accumulation. So Solow had a very elegant model, which is a kind of benchmark of modeling in growth, but to tell you that without technical progress, without something called technical progress, you could not have long-run growth of per capita GDP. Capital accumulation alone would not give you the growth, okay? So you needed that. But Solow would not, that here is the front page of his 1956 paper in the QJE that gave him the Nobel Prize in 1987. But the problem is that he didn't explain where technical progress was coming from. And at the time I was studying, I took some lectures here and there, and for example, Dick Caves at Harvard, when we said, well, there is this guy Schumpeter. I had read a bit of Schumpeter, but and I thought, well, this is really interesting, but where is the model? And there was no model of creative destruction. Where is the empirics? At the time, I didn't know. In fact, now I should not say there was no empirics, because you just told me, Sam, that you did some empirics of Schumpeterian. So, but I didn't know your the work. So then, in 1987, in the fall of 1987, when I started at MIT as a first-year assistant professor, my neighbor was Peter Howitt, and Peter Howitt was visiting from Western Ontario, and Peter had done search theory and monetary theory, but he had a lot of Bellman equations. I had done some Bellman with learning by experimentation, but he was more, and I had done IO, imperfect competition. So we said, why don't we join forces and we build a growth model which has, competition at the heart of it. And why don't we just formalize Schumpeter? Why don't we just build a model around the notion of creative destruction? So what we did with Peter Howitt really in the fall of 1987 is exactly 35 years ago. We build a paradigm which revolves around those three ideas. First idea, long-run growth is driven by cumulative process of innovation, where each innovator builds upon previous innovations, okay? So this cumulative process of innovation. Second idea, innovations do not come from heaven. They result from entrepreneurial activities motivated by the prospect of innovation rents. You innovate because you think you'll get some rents from them, some temporary monopoly rents because you have a better product or because you produce cheaper than potential competitors, and that gives you some rents at least for a while. And the third idea is creative destruction. New innovations displace old technologies. And we build a model that embodies those three things. But you can see right away that at the heart of I will just get some water there. No, thank you so much. You can see right away that at the heart of the growth process, you have a contradiction. Because on the one hand, you need innovation runs to motivate innovation activities. It's the prospect of those runs that motivate innovators. But on the other hand, yesterday's innovators are tempted to use their runs to prevent subsequent innovators because they don't want themselves to be subject to creative destruction. And regulating capitalism is largely about how to manage this contradiction. Whether you talk about secular stagnation, whether you talk about the middle income trap, whether you talk about inequality and growth, you always come across, whether you talk about green innovation, we always come across this contradiction. And how you manage this contradiction. And it comes back, and we'll repeatedly come across this contradiction. Okay? Now, this supertarian paradigm was completely changing the landscape. It's not that I want to say bad things about other growth models. But it's true that this paradigm gives center stage to firm dynamics. You have entry, exit, firm growth, firm shrinking. No such thing in other growth models. And it gives center stage to cross-firm heterogeneity. It's all about incumbents and entrants, about leaders and followers, about small firms and large firms. And it's a completely new way to have a dialogue between data and theory. And very much this dialogue was very important step was here, because here I met with Richard Blondel and I worked with Wendy. Wendy introduced me to John Van Reenen, and it's here that really the dialogue started. Prior to being here, we were doing mainly theory, and here we started doing the dialogue between theory and microeconometrics, firm level, econometrics, and that was a completely new way to do growth. Okay, so I will be. So, for example, the distinctive predictions of the Schumpeterian approach. One prediction is that growth is positively correlated with firm turnover. If I had your slides, I would have shown that. Apparently, you showed that in the 70s already. You had some evidence of that. Whenever you can do cross-country, or you can do cross-US states, or you can do cross-commuting zone, whatever you want, you put on the horizontal axis a measure of creative destruction, which is firm turnover or job turnover, and you put on the vertical axis productivity growth or whatever, and you find a positive correlation. You tend to grow more whenever you have more turnover. That's no other growth model would predict this one. Okay? A second thing is that you tend to have a positive relationship between firm age and firm size. That's a figure from Clino and Say. I'm sure many of you have seen that figure. The idea is that when I start with one activity. And then, how do I get one activity? Because I do better than one of you on one of your activities. So I become one activity firm. But then I want to do more, so I try to expand, and I want to innovate on someone else's activity. And I get to be a two-activity firm. But maybe on the way I may shrink because someone may replace me on one of my activities. So when you are young, you are one activity firm. Then you may disappear on the way, but if you survive, you're damn good, and you are able to grow more and to take over many other activities. So you have very naturally with this, you grow, you enter because you take over one activity, you grow because you take over more activity, you shrink because Henry is doing better than me on one of my activities, and I exit if I only one activity left, and Henry comes, and then I'm done, I'm exiting. So that world, gets this. But what's very interesting is that the US is steeper than Mexico, and France is more like Mexico. And why? Because in US, when you are good, you can get financing more easily. And also, because if you are good, you can do more, you tend to have a selection effect. That means the good one those who survive are the really good one, and therefore they have growth potential much more. And that explains why you have a steeper relationship, in the US than you have in Mexico or in other places. Okay? And of course, you get that those are the exit rates by age. And you see that the young firms exit more than the old firm. When I'm a young firm, I'm a one-activity firm. It takes one creative destruction on me for me to exit. If I am an older firm, I have more activities. So it takes more creative destruction for me to exit. And so you get very naturally that you have, the exit rates, whether it's in the US or in France, goes down with your age. Where the older you are, the less likely you are to exit. Okay, those are things just to familiarize, You get acquainted with the kind of dialogue between data and modeling that you have with the Schumpeter. And this is the other theories makes no sense of this. No name, but you need this one. Okay, another prediction is that more intense competition enhances innovation in frontier firms, discourages it in non-frontier firms. Suppose I always say you are a classroom, everybody is equally good, but suppose some of you are better, are the top of the class, others are the bottom of the class. I open the door and I let a very good element in. What will happen? The top of the class will work harder to remain the top of the class. Those are the blue firms, the firms that are close to the technological frontier in their sector. But those who are behind, they were already discouraged. They will be even more discouraged when I let the new element in. And those are the non-frontier firms. And you can see, and of course, the more developed the country is, the more blue firms there is in the country compared to the orange firms. So you get right away that the more developed the country is, the more growth enhancing it is to have more competition in that country. That will be very helpful when I talk about middle income trap. Okay, so just to get you familiar, you see, always heterogeneity, frontier firm, non-frontier firm, leaders, followers, entrants, incumbents, small firms, large firms, okay. Okay, so now just to set the stage, okay, now we can start, we can the clock, 0. So what we can do is to use the lens of this paradigm to do three main things. One is to revisit some enigmas in economic history. One is to question some common wisdoms, and then I end up with rethinking the future of capitalism. Okay? So some enigma. One enigma is a secular stagnation. We were talking about Bob Gordon, so here we are. You see, the enigma is how come the average annual rate of TFP growth in the US went down so much here after having gone up between 1995 and 2005. This is the average yearly rate of productivity growth, of TFP growth, of total factor productivity growth. And why did it go down in the US despite the IT revolution and despite the artificial intelligence revolution? Those which should have boosted productivity growth. What's very interesting is that this is particularly true in IT producing sectors, which is the black, or in IT using sectors, which is the gray. So it has to do with IT. And the most convincing explanation is that with the IT revolution, it favored the emergence of superstar firms. John Van Reenen, David Autor, Larry Katz et al. Have studied these superstars. There you have emergence of superstar Walmart, Google, Amazon. They took advantage of the IT. They were good. They had good social capital, and they took advantage of the IT to expand. They were more productive than the others. So when they started to expand, it raised productivity growth. But then when they expanded through merger and acquisition, and they ended up invading many sectors of the economy, and they inhibited innovation by non-superstars. So we go back to the Schumpeter prediction. Schumpeter was very pessimistic about capitalism because Schumpeter thought that the first innovators, when I talk about the contradiction before, Schumpeter thought, when I talk about this contradiction, what did I hear? Schumpeter thought that the first innovators would turn into entrenched incumbents, entrenched conglomerates that would successfully prevent any subsequent innovation. So he thought capitalism was doomed. I am more optimistic. I think there are forces that can help you avert the pessimistic prediction of Schumpeter. But you could tell me, well, look, no, here it's exactly what Schumpeter thought. Here you have these superstar firms that inhibit innovation by non-superstar firms. Okay? And you see entry, this is the entry rate of new firms in the US, and you see the entry rate by size of firms. And you see that the entry rate, whether you take large firms or small firms, the entry rate goes down. So it's true that eventually the superstar firms discourage the entry of new firms. Okay? And so, a pessimistic person would tell you, this is it, quoi. There is nothing you can do. What I would say is, no, competition policy in the US was not adapted to the digital era. We let those firms expand through merger and acquisition without wondering whether those merger and acquisition would prevent subsequent entry, subsequent innovation. If you change competition policy in the US, you might revert that thing. And in fact, the Biden administration a year ago took some steps to change competition policy. And the idea there is that competition policy can help you revert that thing, you see? And so that's the first enigma. But at least you can understand how come a bad thing came out of a good thing. Because, you know, growth is the result of technical progress and institutions. If the institutions here, competition policy, do not adapt, you don't get growth. You get the opposite. Okay? That's the secular stagnation dilemma. Another one is the middle income trap. Korea had a very high growth rate, South Korea, after the Korean War. Very high growth rate. But you can see that the growth rate went down. And the growth rate went down a lot because, in fact, you have two ways to grow. You can grow by catching up with the frontier, which is this. I catch up with A bar. Or I can grow because I innovate upon myself. I go from A to gamma A, where gamma is greater than 1. When I am way below A bar, the main source of growth is catching up. But when I am getting close to A bar, it's really frontier innovation that becomes important. But the policies that are good for catching up are not the same policies that induce frontier innovation. We already saw competition. We saw that competition was particularly important here, not so much there. Okay? But there are other policies. When you are in the business of catching up, no big deal if you don't have much labor market flexibility. No big deal if you don't have much equity financing. No big deal if you don't have graduate schools. But when you are in the business of frontier innovation, you need graduate schools, you need equity financing, you need more flexible labor and product markets. And so you need to reform. You need to go to reform your economy, to go from institutions that are good for catching up into institutions that are good for frontier innovation. The problem is the conglomerates, always these conglomerates, because during the catching up period in Korea, you had the emergence of conglomerates. I don't know if anybody is from Korea, but my Korean is very bad. I only know one name, one word, chaobols. The chaobols, I don't know how you pronounce that, which are the name of the Korean conglomerates. These chaobols, when they grew, during the catching up phase of Korea, they discouraged entry of non-chaobol firms, but they did worse than that. They somehow discouraged the government from implementing more competition and more openness. And what's very interesting in Korea, that's work I did with Sergei Gureyev, is that, in fact, I detail here the period between 1990 and 2010. They had a crisis in the late 90s in Korea. They had a financial crisis. And what the financial crisis did is to weaken the power of the chaobols, and that not only unleashed entry forces and innovation forces, but it also made it possible to impose on the Korean government competition and openness policies. And that's how come you get this growth going up a bit, but it again goes down. But you got some growth, you got some boosting effect on entry and on by new firms and on innovation, thanks to that. So that's interesting to see that. But what's interesting also with the middle income trap is that not only the conglomerates discourage new entry, but they have the possibility to put pressure on governments, not to change the institutions, so as to go towards more innovation-enhancing institutions. Okay. A third one is inequality. So we get closer to the topic of today. Okay, and so, of course, there's been this work by Piketty, Atkinson, Saez, showing the rise in the share of income of the top income earners. Here, you show in the US the share of income of the 1% US citizens who earn the most. You take the one who earn the most, then the second highest, etc. You move down to get 1% of the population of those who earn the most. And you get the total of what they earn. And that's the share of income of the top 1% income earners. But you can do the same for the top 0.1 income earners. What you can see is that it has gone up a lot since 1980. So we all agree there. Piketty and I, we agree. But then we start not agreeing, okay? Where we don't agree. Where we don't agree is what is the source of the increase in top percent. One source is innovation. Why? Because I told you when you innovate, you get rents from innovation. And the rents from innovation increase the probability that you will get to the top 1% income share. Mr. Skype becomes rich because he invents Skype. Steve Jobs becomes rich because he invents Apple. That's one way to become rich. But innovation is a source of top income inequality But it's a good source. Why is it a good source? Because it gives you growth. And also, it gives you, and I will show it in a moment, social mobility. Why? Because innovation entails creative destruction. But what is creative destruction? Is people replacing other people. Is new entrants replacing incumbents. That's a source of social mobility. And that's what's very interesting with innovation. It has opposite effects. It's true on the one hand, it increases top income inequality, but on the other hand, it increases social mobility. So then you may want to look, what is the effect of innovation on global inequality, like the Gini measure, more global measure of how far you are from perfect equality. And we will see that it has no effect on the global inequality. So it's a good source of top income, because it increases top income, yes, but it increases growth, it increases social mobility, and it does not raise broad inequality. So I take it. But voilà, that's the difference. So here we go. That's based on work published in the Review of Economic Studies with Aksigit, Bergeau, Blandel, and Emus. And here it's cross-US states panel. So here we rank US states, same US state, like Massachusetts, maybe here 1 year, maybe here 1 year. You see, the same state might move. It's a state in a year that you have on the horizontal axis. So the horizontal axis is innovation intensity. You know, if I am there, I know how much innovation I had. I use patent data, okay, and citation-weighted patents, okay. So if I have well-cited patents, I know that year I look at the flow of the citation-weighted flow of patents, and I know if I was more or less innovative. The continuous curve, it gives you, the share of income of the top 1% in the state. And you can see that there is a positive relationship, and we show in the paper it's a causal. In places where you have more innovation intensity, the share of income of the top 1% in that state is higher. And it's a causal relationship. We have an instrument, and so I don't want to detail, I have no time to detail. But if you look at the effect on the Gini, which is a global measure, you see no effect at all of innovation intensity on the Gini. So it's an interesting source, okay? Yes? No, global means globally with the whole population. How globally we are, the population of the country is away from perfect equality. Gini equals 0 when everybody earns the same, and it's 1 where almost everybody earns 0, and the very top earns everything. And that's the Gini. Okay? So that's what innovation does. And one interesting thing is that innovation increases social mobility. You can see that here I look at commuting zones, very much building on work by Raj Chetty and co-authors. And what we do is that we show is that in the US commuting zones that have most social mobility, that have most innovation intensity, they are those where you have more social mobility, because you have more creative destruction. And in fact, there is another thing there as well. That's based on current work with Bergeau, Blandel, and Griffiths. We look at the wage of unskilled labor, in innovating and non-innovating firms. And we see that innovating firms, not only they pay better at any age of the worker, the innovating firms pay better their workers than non-innovating, but also the prospects for wage increase over your career is much better when you are employed in an innovating firm than when you are not. Because innovating firms, they rely a lot on what you call soft skills. Even if you are not high education, an innovating firm needs to give you much more soft skills. How you coordinate with other people, how you take, those are how trustworthy you are, all those things which are not things you learn at school, you learn in the firm. Those are what we call the soft skills. Innovating firms provide more soft skills. They need to rely more on soft skills. So you see, it's interesting. Innovation, from many points of view, is good for social mobility. Okay? And so that's what's good with innovation. On the other hand, lobbying is another source of top income inequality. I can get top income inequality because I lobby to keep my rents. Okay? But that's very bad, because what does it mean I lobby? I lobby the government to prevent, it's like the troubles. I lobby to prevent entry. So that will reduce growth and innovation. One. Number two, it will reduce social mobility because I reduce entry. It's particularly innovation by new entrants that drives social mobility. And because I reduce social mobility at the same time as I increase top income inequality with lobbying, lobbying will increase global inequality at the same time. So lobbying is a bad source of inequality. Innovation is a good source. In the world of Piketty, so I always contrast Steve Jobs and Carlos Slim. Steve Jobs has become rich because he created Apple. Carlos Slim, I don't know about his youth, but the Carlos Slim that I know, you might know better. I was married to someone, anyway, maybe from UCL. From UCL, actually, I should not say from Mexico. That's not why we divorced. But it's true. When I would make phone call to my in-laws, it would cost 10 times the cost of anywhere because Carlos Slim is at the head of an unregulated telecom company in Mexico, and that's how he is so rich. So in Piketty's world, you only have Carlos Slims. In my world, you have a mixture of Carlos Slims and Steve Jobs. And so you have to be careful. You cannot treat both the same way, okay? And I will show you what lobbying does. If you want to look at lobbying and top income inequality, here again is cross-state panel, US. The states which have more lobbying, they have higher share of income of the top 1%. But the difference is that if I now look at the Gini, the US states where you are most lobbying, they have also bigger Gini, more global inequality. So lobbying is a bad source of inequality. So it's very important to know the source of the rent. The rent in itself, that means nothing. If it's an innovation rent, it's not the same as if it is a lobbying rent, you see. And there are ways to identify what they are. Okay, but even if it's an innovation rent, you have to be careful because even if it's an innovation rent, even Mr. Steve Jobs could use his rents to prevent subsequent entry. But how you deal with that? Not only with tax policy is important, but with competition policy and with rules to finance political campaigns. In the US, we know that, companies, the rich people can finance campaigns without any limit, and that completely biased, they buy out politicians. We know that in our countries, it's much harder. We have strict rules for financing of political campaigns. So that's how you make sure that to limit, the influence that rich, even a Steve Jobs could have on the economy, on subsequent entry. Okay, so that's the way I look at equality and inequality. So that's the first part of the two. I would like now to say, so we look at common wisdoms, okay, and each time it's always this contradiction. How I deal with that, okay, between giving rents but making sure the rents are not misused. The second thing we can do is to question common wisdoms. So bad ideas. A bad idea is that you should just subsidize incumbent firms to foster innovation. One view, the other growth models would tell you just subsidize R&D of existing firms. Relax credit constraint whenever. Alors, it's true to some extent. It might be true that firms may not do as much R&D investment because they are credit constrained or because they are, and you may want to help them. But the difference between the Schumpeterian approach and other models is that we would worry about entrance. We would say, yes, but be sure that you are not subsidizing a zombie, that you are not subsidizing a non-productive innovator at the expense, thereby raising the entry cost of someone potentially better. And that's the difference. And when you have that, for example, here I look, if I relax the credit constraint from a very credit constraint, other growth models would tell you that it's just, as you relax the credit constraint, you increase productivity growth. In my world, you might have an inverted U, because maybe starting from a very highly credit constrained world, relaxing the credit constraint would allow firms to invest more in R&D, but at some point, it might create a zombie phenomenon, and it might allow the worst innovators in the economy to remain and to make it more costly for potentially better innovators to come in. And that's where you start having this going down. You see what I mean? And so the difference when you do industrial policy, for example, or you think about credit relaxing, in the Schumpeterian world, you should always think about entrance. You should factor in entry, which other growth models don't do. You see, that's a big difference. And that may lead to very different ways, though, to do policy. Okay? So that's a common wisdom that I want to. The first common wisdom is that the relationship would always be increasing. No, in my world, it sees inverted U because of this zombie phenomenon. Okay? And now I may go to another one, to another thing. Taxing robots protects employment. That's my thing with Daron Acemoglu. With Daron Acemoglu, I have a very interesting relationship, you see. It's love and hate, quoi. When I work with him, it's great. it's like flying, from westward or eastward. When you fly eastward from New York to London, it goes fast because you have the wind behind. That's when you write a paper with Darren Aceboglu. When you write a paper not with Darren Aceboglu, and then you have the wind against you. Boom! You take 3 more hours. Okay, so that's or you may not get alive. Yeah. So you may not survive the experience. So there's been work on automation, explaining that automation is the worst thing that can happen. And in fact, there's been historically a movement, the Luddites movement was the fear that the steam engine revolution would suppress employment, and there was the Luddites movement. Then when you had the electricity revolution, Keynes was worried that would create mass unemployment in the US in the 1930s. And again, with the IT and the AI revolution, there's been the fear that, you could have mass unemployment. And there's been the idea that you should tax robots. Maybe somewhere you should tax robots, but should you tax them in France? Yeah, I know. I know. So I've been doing work with Xavier Jarabel, who is my colleague at the LSE, and Céline Antoine Simon-Vidal, who are my co-authors on the book. And we looked firm-level data, always go firm-level before. And we looked at the effect of automation. We tried many measures of automation. And we looked firm with that automate at time zero. What is the effect on employment? It's a positive effect. You see, it's a positive effect. Here we look at, modern manufacturing capital investment. Here we look at Aceboglu's own measure, based on imports of robots. Then we have another measure which is just robots, your own investment. Whichever measure you take, firms that automate more in France, they create employment. How come? Because it's true that machines replace labor. So you will say, how come you create employment? But the thing is that when you automate, you become more productive. Because you become more productive, what happens is that your quality-adjusted price goes down. And you have a bigger market worldwide. And because you have a bigger market worldwide, you have a bigger demand for your product. And therefore, you demand more employment. Your sales go up, and your export sales go up. And as a result, you employ more. But what happens is that, of course, when you automate, you destroy employment in your competitors' firms. And of course, if your competitors are all from the same country, it's a zero-sum game, because what I create is destroyed by my competitors. But many sectors are open. And so the business stealing takes place with firms that are abroad. So that's why in France, it's mainly driven by the open sectors that, of course, we destroy jobs elsewhere, but it's elsewhere. It's not in France, you see. And that's why you have this positive effect. So if you now on employment of automation, now if you tax robots in France, it's very bad because you prevent these firms. It's like if you tax innovation. You prevent these firms from doing something that makes them more productive. Therefore, you prevent them from raising their market size worldwide, and therefore you prevent them from increasing employment. You shoot yourself in the feet so that you kill a bad idea. So I love to kill bad ideas. And I have some colleagues in France that are very good at producing ideas that I love to kill. Voilà. Otherwise, it's not fun. I mean, controversies and killing bad ideas. I mean, that's what you should always think about. I mean, that's what it's fun. Otherwise, it's boring, solve. Alors, the last one idea, which is also very fashionable in France, is décroissance. La décroissance, quoi. The idea, the degrowth. Degrowth. It was on purpose I put it in French first because it's a French specialty, la camembert. So, la décroissance. So the idea there is that, you should have negative growth to solve the climate problem. Alors, historically, there is ground to that because if you look at the evolution of temperature worldwide, it's starting to take off exactly when growth took off. If you look at the Madison worldwide per capita GDP, it's exactly like this. The worldwide per capita GDP is essentially flat and takes off with the first industrial revolution in 1920. And it's exactly the same curve as the temperature curve. And that's the counterfactual. Hadn't we had the industrial revolution, that would be the temperature. So on that ground, the degrowth, to say, look, historically we are right. But should we go back to pre-1820? Would you like to live the life of pre-1820? It was awful. You would have low life expectancy. You would be in bad health most of the time. You would have penible work. Now we live longer. Penibility has gone down. We have much more time for leisure. You know, everything going to the doctor is much nicer now than it was. Going to a dentist, you know, at the time it was horrible to go to, was not even a dentist, you know, that would take off your teeth, you know. It just make progress. And we had a natural experiment of negative growth. It was the lockdown. You know, before the vaccine was invented, between March and May, June 2020, we had to lock down. The French GDP went down 35%. CO2 emissions by France went down 8%. So if you mean that if we want to do the degrowth, we should be permanently with the first lockdown. I don't know what the secondary effects in England were, but I can tell you the young generations in France, they were demolished by the first. We had to do it. We had no choice at the time. The vaccine was not there. But a world with no growth is a world without vaccines, without innovation, and it's a world where the only thing you can do is zero COVID. And then you are in China, and then you can kill yourself, okay? So that's the thing. And so that's the thing, you see? And I always tell a degrowth, I say, look, you know, there was the dentist of the 1950s, you know, with the drilling forever. And there is a dentist now. You go to the dentist of the 1950s. If you are degrowth, you will go to the dentist of the 1950s. And then I convert anybody into a positive growth guy, immediately. That's the thing. It's so simple, you know. I had to think about this. Yeah. So that's of course, the alternative. You can see also China and India is when they grew that CO2 emissions of India and China started to take off. So it's true historically, but would you want China to go back to where it was before 1978 or whatever? You know, poverty fell dramatically as a result of growth in China and India. It was the main source of poverty reduction. So the other alternative is to have green innovation. But the problem is that innovation is not spontaneously green. Why? Because firms that innovate, then I go back to my incumbents, you know. Incumbent firms that innovated in dirty technology in the past, they tend to continue innovating in dirty technology in the future. Why? Because you keep doing what you are good at. We call that path dependence. So that's of course, creative destruction would help you there because new firms would not have that problem. But so you need the state to redirect technical change, innovation of firms, of incumbent firms, from dirty to clean technology. You can do that with the carbon tax or the carbon price, but then if you increase too much the carbon price, you get the yellow vest. Be my guest. Okay, you get the Champs-Élysées in fire. Okay, so you can do some of it, but you cannot do too much. So you need other things. The other things are green industrial policy. We should have a green DARPA. And the other thing is that you should have also civil society. What we can show, and I don't want to show you tables, is that, in fact, consumers push firms to innovate clean. And it's very simple when you are in a competitive environment. So I'll take the example of Sam and myself. Sam is virtuous. Sam would innovate green. But Sam is not yet there. I am the incumbent, okay? And I am not virtuous. So maybe consumers want to consume green, but I don't care because they have to buy from me, they have to purchase from me, and I have no competitor. So I keep doing my dirty stuff, okay? But then comes Sam, and Sam forces me to innovate clean, because if I don't innovate clean, green, I lose my customers to Sam. And you can see how the consumer's willingness to consume green, and that's education, that's combined with competition, is a fantastic force to redirect firms' innovation towards green. In fact, we calculated with my co-authors that it's equivalent to 3 times the price increase that triggered the yellow vest in France. The combination of consumers' willingness to consume green and the competition is a fantastic force to push for. And that's civil society there. And we'll get to the Sam and Wendy's triangle, okay? That's what's very, you know, this is a very strong force. And you innovate green to escape competition. You see the escape competition effect I told you now? Now here, you innovate green to escape competition with Sam. Well, and that's a very powerful force. So you have tools. That's why, again, I'm an optimist. I think there are ways out that can trigger green innovation. Carbon price, industrial policy green. So we should create DARPA with England in it. Alors, my big thing that you can say, I am in favor of going beyond Brexit, and I think we should have a Europe of projects on things like energy, health, defense and space, we should have UK completely reintegrated, and France should have as main partners Germany and the UK. And I don't care Brexit, no Brexit. I think I'm pushing this idea. I think that's the future. And in particular for energy, we can do great things together. Okay, and so that's what I want to show. Again, I'm optimistic because I said there are forces, state, civil society, and firms together. We can do a lot to fight climate change through pushing green innovation. Okay, now I'm getting at the last part. Okay, and the last part is Rethink Capitalism because it was part of the title. So otherwise you came for that, and so I've not yet. Okay, so here we rethink capitalism. What COVID we already knew, but COVID made it even plainly, even more obvious that the US is not a fantastic social model. You don't want to be poor, you don't want to be poor in the US. You are not well protected against something like COVID or against losing your job, and I will be more precise in a moment. But Europe is not fantastic on innovation compared to the US. So let me be more precise on that. Here is what happened with COVID. With COVID, the gray curves are the US, the black curves are Germany, okay? And what happened is that with COVID, with the lockdown, unemployment went up a lot in the US. But the problem in the US, when you lose your employment, you have a probability to use health insurance. And that's the fraction of US population without health insurance is the circles. And you see it had gone down with Obamacare. You see the beauty of Obamacare? Obamacare is right there. It worked. It worked. But it went up during COVID at the time where people needed health insurance. In Germany, the fraction of people without health insurance is zero throughout. And I could put France, I could put continental Europe, whatever. And UK, probably, yeah. Okay, so that's something. But the same thing with poverty. The risk of falling into poverty. When you lose your employment in the US, you have probability of falling into poverty. And that's the poverty rate in the US went up with COVID. In Germany, it remained constant. So you see, and another thing also in the US is Gini, for example. The Gini, I remember, measure of global inequality, higher in the US than, for example, Germany, France, Scandinavia. Poverty rate higher in Germany than in France, and I'm sure UK is lower than also than Gini and lower poverty rate than US. Okay. So on those grounds, US is worse. And one thing also which is not good is the work of, we know from Anne Case and Angus Deaton, they look at the mortality of middle-aged white non-Hispanics unskilled in the US. And the rate of mortality among them has gone up a lot. And they call that death of despair. Those are people who are so stressed losing their job because, when you lose job, you may lose health insurance, you get into poverty, your family dislocates, you get through a lot of stress. So they start taking opioids, sleeping pills, eating pizza too much, and they die, okay? And that's Deaton case, okay? No such thing in continental Europe. UK, it's a bit increasing, but not as much as US, okay? And that's what voilà. But on the other hand, the flip side is that the US on innovation is much better than we are. This is the flow of triadic patents per million inhabitants. Triadic, those are patents that are registered in the US Patent Office, Japanese Patent Office, and Europe and US Patent Office. You see that the US is way above the EU average and way above China. Okay? And I could show other measures, patent application per million inhabitants, number of top 5 cited patents, percentage of top 5 cited patents. On all these measures, US is way above everybody. Why? Because they have a fantastic ecosystem of innovation. Great, well-funded universities. They have the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Health, the Howard Hughes Medical Investigator, which is a private donors foundation to finance top research in biotech, only for basic research. Then when you go from basic research to startups, they have very well developed venture capital. When you want to go innovation in bigger firms, they have institutional investors. They have the whole ecosystem. And they have the DARPA and the BARDA, the Defense Advanced Project Research Agency, and the equivalent BARDA for biotech. They have a fantastic ecosystem. We are really Lilliput. You have Gulliver and Lilliput. We say Lilliput. We are, compared to the US, we are not as good. Voilà. We are rikiki, we say. What we would like, some people believe, my dream would be to have a capitalism which is as innovative as the US, but as protective and inclusive as Europe, particularly Scandinavia, Germany, and all that, okay? Some people believe that if you choose to be more innovative, it has to be at the expense of being more inclusive and protective. If you choose to be protective and inclusive, you have to sacrifice being innovative. I disagree with that. That's another Acemoglu I disagree with. So I disagree with this view. I believe that there are policies that can make you both more innovative and more inclusive and protective. And I will give you 3 policies. That will be my conclusion. Flex security on the labor market, education, and competition. Let me talk about them in turn. In Denmark, here that's the death of despair in the US. But in Denmark, when you get unemployed, 5 minutes. In Denmark, when you get unemployed, for 2 years you have 90% of your salary, and up to a certain level of salary, of course. And then the state helps you retrain and find a new job. If you refuse more than 2 jobs in your qualification, you lose the unemployment benefit. But that's the system. It makes creative destruction work very well because a worker who loses her job, she retrains and she rebounds on the labor market. So it makes creative destruction work much better. But on the other hand, if you look at the effect of being unemployed in Denmark, that's the beauty. It's work by Alexandra Roulet, my colleague at INSEAD. She compares the health of a worker in a firm that closes down between 2001 and 2006 to the health of an identical worker in age, education, experience in a firm that does not close down. It's a diff in diff. No effect on purchase of antidepressants. No effect on the probability to visit hospital for circulatory problems. No effect on mortality. They found a system which is both very efficient in terms of making creative destruction work well and very good in terms of protecting individuals. That's one example. I get 2 more. One is education. There's been work looking at what is the probability of inventing as a function of parental income. And you can see in the US, when you have your parents on the top income centiles, you are much more likely to innovate. This is the probability of inventing. This is the decile or the centile in of your parents' income in the income distribution. So the more to the right you are, the richer your parents are. And you can see you have this kind of J-curve in the US. That's the work of Bell, Shetty, Jaravel, Petkova, Van Reenen, QJE 2019. That's the work by Axel Grisby Nicholas, US historical. That's what we found on Finland. And that was an enigma for me. How come Finland? Finland, you have an education system which is free and very high quality, a very good PISA test. How come is it in Finland? And so here is the enigma of Finland. And if I control in Finland for parental education, the curve flattens out because it's not so much that they pay for me. It's that the higher earner parents are also more educated parents and they transmit knowledge and aspirations to me, thereby increasing my probability of inventing. It goes through education. Okay? Not because they give me the money, because it's free, the school there. But that was not the end of it. I said, but still, if the education system is so good in Finland, why would parental education matter at all? And finally, after 6 years, we solved the enigma. They had the reform in 1970 of the education system. Until 1970, very few people would go all the way to end of high school. They would stop at grade 7 or 8. You see, they would not go through grade 12. And they had the big reform in 1970, making education still very high quality, but accessible to everybody, all the way to the 12th grade. And now, if I compare the probability of inventing for children who went to school after the reform, compared to those who were to school before the reform, that's work with Otto Toivonen. You see the probability goes up for those with parents who are not rich. Of course, for those with parents high, it was already high. But here, you see the huge effect. Now, you see the problem we have in our countries. There are a lot of what my colleagues Bell et al. Call lost Einsteins. There are many smart kids, but they are born to the wrong family, who cannot give them education and aspiration. Okay? And what the education reform did in Finland is to reduce the number of lost Einsteins. There are many children who could become innovators, but they're not innovators because they're born to the family who cannot give them the inputs to become innovators. But when you have the reform of Finland, then many more people can become innovators, so you make the Finnish economy more innovative, but also more inclusive, because many more people participate to the growth process. And I finish up with competition. So education is something that makes you more innovative and more inclusive. And finally, competition, I go back to what I said, in secular stagnation, but and I know that entry went down in the US. Now, what happens? Suppose you do competition reform. Suppose you say, now when I look to do merger and acquisition, I look at the effects on new entry, new innovation. I break up firms, if I have to break up firms, whatever. I do, very important, I adapt competition policy in the US. That will boost innovation because you have many potential innovators so far in the US that cannot enter, they are discouraged by the superstar firms. But at the same time, entrant innovation, I know, increases social mobility. So if I reform competition policy, I increase innovation and I increase inclusiveness because I increase social mobility. So those are policies that can make you both more innovative. And I end up with the Sam and Wendy. Sam and Wendy tell us that the response, the future is in this triangle. You need firms and markets, you need state, and you need civil society. My way of saying, of paraphrasing what they do, of that, I say, you had Schumpeter was very pessimistic. He thought that yesterday's innovators would discourage future innovation. Then I said, okay, the state can have competition policy and limit that, can regulate. But the state, we saw with Korea, it can be bribed by firms. And that's where civil society is crucial. Because civil society can limit the extent to which incumbent firms can bribe the state, and thereby making it easier to have competition. Because already, of course, you could say judges could control the executive, but the Constitution is an incomplete contract, and it's hard to enforce. Who will make sure the incomplete contract is enforced? Civil society. And that's why the response, the triangle, is my response to, is the response that I have to propose to the Schumpeter pessimism. And that will be the way to make more innovative and more inclusive and greener growth. And we saw that on green growth. We saw firms tend to innovate dirty when they innovated dirty in the past. The state can intervene with carbon tax and industrial policy green. But we saw the role of civil society. Consumers can also play a very important role. The name and shame plays a huge role as well. So, voilà, that's it. I'm done. That's the book, The Power of Creative Destruction. In fact, Jan is here. Thanks to Jan. Voilà, that book came out, we worked together. It was a joint adventure on this book, Harvard University Press. And there is a forthcoming book, which was also initiated with Jan, which is a book of Festschrift. There was a conference on the economics of creative destruction, because I have my own creative destruction. The young generation have to supersede all what we've done with Howitt. And if you want to see what they do, it's in this book, which is forthcoming in July, Harvard University Press. Thank you very much. Sorry to have been very... Thank you.
So, Philippe, thanks very much. Oh, you want to wind me up? I'm probably okay with the mic, to be honest. Yeah. So thanks very much for that insightful and enthusiastic talk. We're going to have time now for Q&A. So please do prepare your questions for Philippe, but I'm going to kick us off. So I want to dig in a little bit to this idea of good versus bad inequality. You showed us that chart showing declining competition in the US, or at least increased concentration. And then you followed with a spirited defense of the innovators, of the founders of those firms, which have become so big and become superstars. So my question is, how do you tell when things have got out of control? How do you tell what's an innovation rent and what's a concentrated economy, especially in a world full of technology where there are increasing two-sided markets and where these big firms may actually be more efficient?
So there are ways to do that. I mean, for example, we are working currently on a paper. It's a first attempt with Pete Clino and other co-authors. And we, for example, we know the TFPQ for the TFP real for firms. We know the TFPR, the TFP model, in the TFP divided by price and the TFP not divided by price. And we know the price. So when you do a new product, typically you can charge a much higher price. When you do process, for example, you don't charge a higher price. So you can tell already if it's if you did a product innovation, one which is more likely to be patented with more spillovers than if you did something which has not as much spillover. So you can use data, TFPR, TFPQ, price, patenting data, to see the extent to which the rent is associated with innovation and with product innovation or not. And so that's what we are experiencing. We can tell from a rent, we have ways to tell from rents if they are more likely to be true product innovation or something else. And so we have a first paper where we do that. But you're right, that's a whole project, a whole research program to be able to tell apart the various sources of rents.
And do you think that the transition to the digital economy, which has made markets much bigger, which has meant that we have Microsoft trying to buy Activision Blizzard so it can sell games through its cloud computing platform, makes it much harder to be a game studio perhaps if you don't have access to that cloud computing platform, but on the other hand, creates this enormous package that consumers can buy, which might be good for consumers. Do you think that kind of digitization kind of makes the Schumpeterian cycle, if you like, run at a higher amplitude where the rents are bigger?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you have the static effect on consumers may be better, but the dynamic effects may be worse. You see, that's also when you have merger and acquisition. For example, I had a discussion with Zuckerberg. He was visiting Paris 3 years ago, and I said, the problem is that you stall growth in the US. I said, how come? And I said, well, because you do merger and acquisition, which discourage innovation. He said, but no, because when I take you over, when I buy you, you will work hard so that I can do a merger and acquisition and acquire you. And that's true. But once you've acquired me, we see typically that innovation by the acquiring firm and by the acquired firm goes down after the merger and acquisition. So in the short run, you have advantages for the consumer. But in the longer term, you don't. You see what I mean? So you have the static versus dynamic. And you lose in the medium and long run. And you have to manage this trade-off.
There's one other thing I'd like to ask you before I kick it over to the floor, which is this idea of green industrial policy, another topic which, of course, is in the news.
Yes.
Because you have these enormous subsidies in the US through the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, green subsidies, which have essentially been focused on American firms. And so the European Union and South Korea are very upset about the subsidies, saying that they're in effect protectionist. Your argument is that the government can come in and push innovation in a green direction with a certain amount of good industrial policy.
Yeah, but
isn't it inevitable that you get captured by protectionist interests? Isn't that what's happened?
Well, I mean, no, because you can do DARPA. You see, the DARPA way, that's what it's like. It's industrial policy which is competition friendly. How it works, the DARPA, for those who don't know, of course you know exactly how it works. But the way it works, the DARPA was created in the 1950s in the US because they were competing with the Soviet Union on space and defense. Particularly, the Soviets put Gagarin in the space. They needed to put someone in space in 2 years. So that's the situation where the basic research has been done, but you need to fulfill a mission to use this basic research to turn it into something, an application in 2 years. For example, putting a man in space or producing a weapon. And so the money comes from the ministry. That's the top-down part. They have team leaders, and the team leaders can elicit competing projects. That's the bottom-up. So what's great with the DARPA, it's a mixture of top-down and bottom-up, and it's competition-friendly. It's a modern way to do industrial policy. They did it in the US with defense and space. GPS, internet, all that is an outcome of DARPA. But then they created ARPA Energy in the US. And then they created the BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, thanks to which we are all here. Without BARDA, we would not be here. Okay. So, and it was the same thing. You have RNA messenger technology. You had to turn it into mass production of vaccine in 1 year. And it's exactly the same way. BARDA is the equivalent of DARPA for biotech. And it's competition friendly. You had many labs competing. And that's the modern way to do it. So what I propose is a European DARPA, which would very much rely on the triplet France, Germany, UK. And we move beyond Brexit. We forget about the thing. We reintegrate UK into Horizon programs. It's very stupid to punish the UK because we punish ourselves. And we move, and for that we need to reinterpret the Maastricht Treaty. And there I believe that we should not put on the same footing spending to finance the retirement, the pension system, and spending to invest in energy transition and growth. You should not do that. What we should do is to reform the state spending, to rationalize it. In France, I'm in favor of reforming the unemployment system and the pension system to make people work a bit longer, to have the credibility to then invest massively in energy DARPA, in defense and space DARPA, and etc. And have the UK involved. And I think that's the future. And so it takes. But you see the problem with Europe. Europe has good tools, but 3 tools are obsolete a bit. They have the Maastricht Treaty, which was done in a very narrow way. You count all the spendings the same way. The investment spending and the recurrent spending. It's absurd. You should not count them the same way. So you have to reinterpret Maastricht. Number 2, They had competition policy which was very much market share oriented. For example, they said we should not have a merger between Alstom and Siemens because any country buy trains but it's a contestable market because anybody can buy high-speed trains from China. Nothing prevents that. And the competition is more with China than inward-looking. So they should have a competition policy in Europe, less inward-looking, more outward-looking. We compete with China and the US mainly. And the third thing is industrial policy. DARPA, we don't know what it is in Europe. There is no DARPA. And we have to create those DARPAs. And I think if we modernize those three instruments, Europe can, but the problem is that Europe has to get these main instruments to be operational. So far, they are not adapted to the modern era.
Okay, I'm going to kick it open to the floor now. Do we have any questions in the audience? Who'd like to kick us off? Yes, over here.
Yes, Simon Breeze from the Financial Times. I'm very interested in your idea of this new paradigm of innovation, which involves inclusivity and protection. I'm thinking in terms of perhaps where is Labour's share in this? Where is Labour's share of income in all this? Is there not a limit, a ceiling to which you can push innovation without encouraging sort of radical interventions like you get in France, like a manifestation or Gilets jaunes protests, for example? I'm saying, is there not a Labour constraint on how far and how fast you can push innovation?
So the yellow vest was very much provoked by something, by various things, but something we underestimated in France. In France, the problem was a lot that we built TGV, high-speed trains. So it was very good commute from Paris to center of Paris to center of Lyon. But the suburban transport in France is absolutely disastrous. That's why Macron proposed a week ago that you should have, S-Bahns everywhere in France, in big metropole, because we have terrible, and the problem is that those who live in suburban areas, they have no alternative but taking their cars. So for a while in France, they pushed the diesel, the gasoil traction. And then they said, no, now gasoil is over. And so those guys who build, houses, in the broad suburb, of Paris or Lyon, they found themselves trapped because they had no alternative to taking their cars. That's what triggered the Yellow Vest movements. They felt they were being, fooled around by the French politicians. You see, so that was very much at the heart. So when you do reforms like that, you have to take into account the inequality, not only income inequality, but geographical inequality and the lack of infrastructure, of alternatives. And that has to be factored in much more. So that will be a way to deal with it. Another thing also is that I think that it's important to negotiate with unions. In France, we have a responsible union with CCFDT. And Macron, I have a huge trouble telling Macron that he should really take respect, and take seriously the head of CFDT when he wants to reform pensions, when he wants to. There was always this view in France that you go faster if you bypass unions. If you bypass no, you save time. You don't waste time if you do that. That's something that in France there is very much this kind of, monarchic power. When you think that if you spend time discussing with, corps intermédiaires, with unions and things, you are wasting your time. No, you are in fact gaining time. So I think that's where, we need to make progress in France on those things, actually.
But were you asking specifically about the Labour share of income there as a sort of metric of inequality?
But in France, it has not gone down that much. I mean, in France, wage for inequality, for example, if you look at inequality in France, post-tax inequality has not gone up much in France. That's the difference between France and maybe UK, but certainly US.
So there's no sense in which...
Inequality themselves... Alors now the wage and if you look at the purchasing power up to the beginning of the energy crisis, if you look at the purchasing power, it went up for all categories in France, up to the onset of the Ukrainian war, up to that point. Then it has deteriorated. But up to then, the purchasing power was maintained for all categories, in fact. And a lot because employment went up, and also because of labor market reforms. And also they reduced some local taxation and les impôts de taxe d'habitation. And so those things together contributed to maintaining purchasing power. Now you have a problem of purchasing power because inflation is rising, but you have that everywhere, maybe less in France and elsewhere. And now we need to negotiate. The difficulty is to avoid the spiral between price and wages. So you need to find a way to go through the inflation. So Macron privileged the prime. You give premiums, you see, but that will maybe be reduced once the inflation goes down, so that you try to avoid the spiral, and partly also by freezing partly the price of energy. They try to find ways to limit the extent of inflation, to limit the probability of a spiral. We can discuss that if they did well, the way they try to manage that. No.
Let's move on to another question. Yes, there's one in the front.
But another way to increase the wage labor is to increase participation, is to increase shareholding by employees. That's, I think, something that should be done and developed. Yeah, sorry for.
Thank you for the really insightful talk. I was wondering, when you discuss innovation frameworks and ecosystems, you mentioned that a sort of rival to the US's ecosystem could be UK, Germany, and France. So in the long term, if it was theoretically feasible, do you think a global innovation framework where policies are targeted at firms irrespective of their geographic location, do you think that would further encourage competition rather than transnational or national frameworks which are targeted at firms solely there? Do you think that might help, like you said, with the open source, jobs being created in one place and destroyed in another? So by homogenizing the top level of where the funding comes from in the ecosystem, do you think that might be fixed as well?
So can you maybe, I want to make sure I heard correctly.
Sorry, I'm not quite sure I followed the point you were. Would you mind repeating that?
Sure. So if
beyond three countries to allow competition in with solution-oriented data type structures.
Yeah.
yes.
Oh, that's right. They should be subject to that. One thing is taxation, for example. It was very important to prevent firms from being taxed always in the cheaper, to have a minimum taxation, the 15%. I think it's very important to limit the extent to which they can, because you see firms that are multinationals, of course, they have a huge edge over non-multinationals because they can choose to be taxed in the lowest tax place, which other firms cannot do, and that biases competition. So anything you can do to limit this power, of course, is a good thing. So when they raise the minimum tax to say 15%, or that went in the right direction, maybe they should have raised more. But those are the kind of things you should do to have a more level playing field. You see, so that multinationals would not have an extreme advantage over other firms.
Okay. So do you think transnational cooperation is the way to go there, or should some international body intervene and sort of impose that structure on countries? Or do you think countries within each other should sign treaties and work that out? Do you think that would be more efficient?
To do what? To do?
How you impose that structure, that idealized structure which you've laid out. How do you actually impose it? Do you get there via sort of bottom-up efforts by companies themselves? Do you need multilateral efforts?
It's a mixture. How do you get there? There are some countries that should push that view and then to try to get multilateral, you see, because you want to avoid dumping. So, for example, if some countries say, no, I don't tax, so I am in favor of Europe, a multi-speed Europe, so the coalition of the willing. If you are really willing to play the game, you are part of the game. You see what I mean? If you don't, you cannot have the cake and eat the cake. You have to play by the rules. You cannot be complete fiscal dumping and benefit from the market the same way. We need to have some rules. I think it's important.
But we're in a moment now of political economy where these global rules are basically under threat and going backwards. The EU and the US are more or less on the.
I know, and WTO is in big jeopardy.
So are you as optimistic about reality and where we might go as you are about the potential to solve these problems?
No,
in the way you lay.
You're right. It's true that you need. Well, I'm optimistic that some countries can show the lead and say you can do this. For example, when Denmark, for example, pushed its own model, I think it has value of example for other countries. You say, well, the Danes, they managed to do this or to do that, or the Swedes, so you have to do it first national, and then you need to coordinate with other, to see if multilaterally, WTO is. IRA is a big problem for WTO. It's obvious, so you have to. But then I think it's important that Europe as a whole, but it could include the UK, be tougher. To say that the US, there are things you can do, things you cannot do. But we were too inward-looking before. When we were looking at competition, we were looking. There is this firm within Europe that does this. We should be much more outward looking. So, competition, we look at competition with, if China or the US, they don't play by the rules, but, but we don't want to implement the retaliation, but we have to show that we could implement the retaliation together, and then negotiate. How was WTO created? I mean, people were negotiating, and there were threat points, as in any negotiation. But in that negotiation, Europe should be more, united when they negotiate with, and when they think of competition industrial policy, they should, because also there was the thing before also, that the US would do industrial policy, China would, and Europe, in the name of competition policy, would bar the word industrial policy, was taboo in Brussels. That's crazy. We should say we do industrial policy, absolutely, but we will do it with good governance. And we should, so of course, how could we win against China and the US if we said that anything that has to do with industrial policy, we were completely Anne Kruger within Europe, you see? And that was not a good policy. And that's where, you see, but we have to modernize these tools. Maastricht, with better Maastricht, with industrial policy DARPA-wide, and with a competition policy which is more outward-looking. If we modernize those tools, Europe will be in much stronger position.
Now, we're running out of time, but with your permission, Wendy, I'll push it to another question, unless we've got a hard stop here. So I think I saw, there's a hand on this side over here, in the middle. Maybe you could pass the mic along? Yes, that's the correct road.
Yeah, I'm Jorge from LSE. Thank you, Professor Aghion. So I want you to elaborate more on your disagreement with Piketty. So you said that it doesn't matter if innovation increase top income inequality as long as it doesn't increase the Gini index or the broad inequality. But I think it seems there's a contradiction here. So if the top income inequality increase, so Facebook, Google, Amazon, they become stronger and stronger. So what is the side effect in the future? So how we regulate it? Because I see the dystopian future if top income inequality is increase and increase. Thank you.
But that's what you do, is you use competition policy. You use tax, but also competition policy.
But
that's the thing. In his world, you don't have competition policy. I believe that competition policy is as much a tool to fight inequality and to reconcile inequality and growth as tax policy can be. You need to have both. And also rules for political campaign to limit the lobbying. So you have the anti-lobbying policy, more broadly the competition policy, and the tax policy. And you need to use both. Because otherwise, if you have only one instrument, you will say to reduce inequality, we use increase a lot tax, but then you discourage innovation. So if you want to raise tax revenues, and you need tax revenues to finance flex security, to finance schools, to finance health, to finance social, you need to raise taxes. But I want to do it in a way that doesn't kill the growth, okay? And that's where you need to use the tax and the competition together. And now I'm working on a project with Richard Blondel, who could not be here with us today, and other co-authors from Paris, Bozio and others, where we are putting, competition and tax together, you see? And that has never been done, because we cross firm-level data with market power with income distribution data, and we can look at where the owners of the firms lie on the income distribution, depending on, and so so the thing is to use both together. You see what I mean? And the response is that you need to combine tax policy with competition policy and with anti-lobbying policy, and that has never been looked at so far, not properly.
We're out of time, so I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. But thank you very much to the Stone Centre for having us. Thank you to the UCL Policy Lab. Sorry, am I handing over now?
No, that's fine. Yeah, just hand over to Imran.
Oh, okay. I'll hand over to Imran, who is going to wrap up.
John. Thanks, Andrew. So I just wanted to say a few words just to bring this part of the evening to a close before we move on to the reception. I can't think of a better way for us to start our public lecture series with Philippe's talk. Very inspiring. I should say, Philippe, 25 years ago, when you were working on those models with Peter, I was one of your students in Oxford. And for the younger members of the audience, Philippe's energy and drive and passion for these issues was exactly the same then as it is now. Probably even increased over time. So if we can just bottle some of that energy for the same centre going forward, I think we will have done a great job. So just thank you again, Philippe.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
For chairing. I'd like to welcome everybody to come to the reception, which is in the Jeremy Bentham room. So we'll just move over there, and thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. You did a great job. So it's okay. I don't expect too much.